She came for letters and promises, but on the platform she found only silence, a waiting horse team, and a name carved on a fresh cross. The train pulled away, its whistle fading into the wide nothing. Smoke drifted across the platform, leaving her alone in the smell of coal and dust. She clutched a small suitcase, the handle worn, the dress she wore already creased from days of travel. In her other hand was an envelope tied with a strip of blue thread. Inside, letters rested, neat handwriting, steady lines, words that had carried her across miles. They had spoken of bread baked each morning, of a roof that didn't leak, of a table waiting for someone to sit across from, of a man named Adam who said he was weary of silence, weary of evenings with no voice to answer his. But Adam wasn't there. The platform was near empty. A boy with a cart slept against a post. The station clerk scribbled in a ledger without lifting his eyes. And by the hitching rail stood a man in a dark hat, shoulders straight, eyes hidden. He didn't move toward her. He didn't speak. She stood longer than she should have, staring down the road that stretched into the hills. Dust shimmered in the heat, but no rider came. Finally, she opened the envelope, slipped out one of the letters, and read the first line again, as if checking she hadn't mistaken the place. The words blurred from the tremor in her hands. The man by the rail shifted. His boots scraped wood. He walked toward her, slow, not out of welcome, but duty. When he stopped, the air between them was heavy. "You're looking for Adam," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. She nodded once, hope rushing back for a moment. He didn't soften. "Adam's gone." The words hit like a fist she couldn't see. Her breath caught. She wanted to ask gone where, but his eyes told her enough. He tipped his hat lower, as if ashamed of the truth. "Name's Eli. I'm his brother." The station quieted. Even the clerk paused his writing. The boy stirred but didn't wake. She felt the emptiness of the letters in her hand. Paper that had brought her here, promises written by a man already beneath the earth. Eli picked up her suitcase without asking. She followed because there was nothing else to do. The horse team waited, stamping against the dust. He tied the bag to the wagon, climbed up, and only after a pause motioned for her to sit beside him. The road away from town was long and bare. She kept her eyes on her lap, letters gripped tight, the thread cutting into her fingers. Eli drove without a word, hands steady on the reins, gaze fixed forward. They passed fields gone to weeds, fences half fallen, a windmill that turned with a broken rhythm. The land was wide, but it felt small with silence pressing in. She thought of the letters, how they had painted this place as gentle, alive, a home waiting. All she saw now was a house sagging under years of use, a barn leaning to one side, and a grave on the hill behind it marked by a cross so new the wood was still pale. He stopped the wagon in the yard, climbed down, untied her case and left it by the steps. She stepped down herself, shoes sinking into dust, throat tight. "That's where he is," Eli said. His eyes flicked toward the hill. He didn't offer comfort, didn't move closer, just fact. She turned, saw the cross, saw the earth not yet settled. Her knees weakened, but she stayed standing. She wouldn't let a stranger see her fall. Inside the house, the air smelled of dust and cold ashes. The table was bare. A single chair sat pushed back, another tipped against the wall. She set her letters on the wood, her hand lingering as if maybe he'd return if she left them there. Eli struck a match, lit the stove, and filled a kettle without looking at her. His movements were deliberate, practiced. He wasn't making room for her, just keeping the house alive as he always had. "You can stay the night," he said finally. "Tomorrow, we'll see." She nodded, though the words hollowed her chest. She wasn't welcome. Not really. She was a letter with no name now, a bride with no groom. That night she lay on a cot in a room meant for no one. The window rattled with the wind. She held the letters close, read them again in the flicker of a lantern. Every word had felt alive once. Now they felt like lies written by a ghost. Outside, Eli sat on the porch, boots planted firm, staring at the hill where his brother lay. He didn't touch the letters. He didn't ask her story. He only kept watch, as if the weight of the house, the grave, and the woman inside were all burdens he hadn't chosen, but couldn't put down. The night deepened. Coyotes sang in the distance. She closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come. The letters lay against her chest like stones. In the dark, she thought she heard the scrape of Eli's chair on the porch. Steady, patient, like a man who stayed awake so others could rest. Morning found her already dressed, hair tied back with the same blue thread that held the letters. The house woke slow. Floorboards remembered feet. Ash in the stove agreed to flame. Eli moved through it all like a man who knew every hinge and stubborn latch. He poured water into a basin, set it near the back door, then stepped aside so she could wash without eyes on her. Courtesy, not welcome. A space, not an invitation. She scrubbed travel from her skin until the water turned gray. Steam rose and faded in the cool air. When she finished, the towel lay folded too neatly, a habit of someone who learned long ago to leave no trace. She watched Eli at the table break a heel of yesterday's bread. He left half of it on the board and walked out to the yard without saying to whom the other half belonged. The yard bore the marks of men who had worked it and men who had left. A gate leaned. The pump sighed before surrendering water. In the far field, weeds wore the summer like a crown. Eli checked fence wire strand by strand, pulling it tight where storms had taught it to slacken. She stood in the doorway, hands idle, then found a broom and started where dust gathered deepest, under the window, along the baseboards, places grief forgot to sweep. She did not ask what to do. She did not ask to stay. She made herself useful in a house where usefulness was a way of earning breath. The letters lay on the mantel, blue thread cutting their stack into certainty. She kept glancing at them as if they might change words when she wasn't looking. They didn't. Neat hand. Quiet promises. A man's steady hope set down in ink that outlived him. At noon, Eli brought in a sack of feed and set it with more force than needed. The board under it complained. He stilled his hand, then eased the weight off. She saw the small correction and understood more than apology would have said. Care lived in him. It just had nowhere to shine. He placed a tin cup by the kettle, then another, then moved the second a hand's width closer to her. She poured. They ate in silence, the kind that isn't hostile, only unfamiliar. The clock on the wall refused to tick. Somewhere a fly tested the window pane and lost. After he hauled wood, she followed with a short armload he could have carried in one hand. He didn't stop her. Outside, the sun climbed. Wind ran its fingers through the grass, then through the loose hair at her temple. Once, when a board slipped, he steadied it before it could catch her palm. His fingers didn't brush her skin. The intention did. By evening, she had claimed no corner and touched everything. The plates sat cleaner. The shelf held order. The bed she hadn't been offered was made tight. Eli watched the way the house changed around her, not softened, but squared, like a fence line finely trued. He went to the hill with a small knife and a cedar scrap. She didn't follow. Alone by the cross, he shaved the wood until a shape came. A plain marker, not for a grave, but for a place on a door where a name might rest if the house ever held one again. He didn't carve letters. He wasn't ready to write anything that might ask to be spoken. That night, coyotes called and answered. She lay with eyes open to the ceiling, counting breath against the roof's slow creak. She turned once and faced the window. Eli's shadow crossed the yard, lantern low, checking the barn latch. Not fear, practice. Some men sleep by trusting a thing. He slept only after testing it. On the second morning, they rode into town. Coffee gone, salt low, nails needed. Eli hitched the wagon without being asked, left room on the bench, and waited for her to climb up before he took the reins. The road shrugged them into dust. She held the letters in her lap, not knowing why she brought them, only that her hands kept reaching for weight. The town square held the usual day, a blacksmith's anvil biting iron, a woman hanging washing from a line behind the mercantile, two boys throwing stones at a post and missing on purpose to stretch the afternoon. As the wagon rolled in, heads turned because heads always turn for strangers. A man at the saloon door spat into the street and smiled with half his mouth. Inside the store, the keep counted coins slow and watched faster. Eli named what he needed and laid down pelts and a small bag of dried beans. The keep's eyes slid to her ring finger, then to her face, then back to Eli's hands. None of it polite, all of it too practiced to be called rude. On the wall near the door, a paper hung crooked. The ink hadn't dried straight. She felt it before she saw it. Some currents reached skin without sound. She turned and read. Estate notice. Adam Sutter, deceased. Claims to be settled in 30 days. Lion held by Carter and Fox. Failure to appear forfeits holdings. Her breath thinned. The letters in her lap grew heavy. A name she knew stood beside words she didn't. Lien, forfeit, appear. The paper named the land as something you could lose by not showing your face when asked, as if grief were a schedule kept by men in neat vests. Eli saw it too. His mouth lost the little it had learned of soft that morning. He took the notice down, smoothed it flat on the counter, and read it once as if the ink might flinch. It didn't. He folded it and tucked it into his coat. The keep said nothing. Eli paid and left. Back on the bench, she stared straight ahead. The world didn't tilt, but it felt as if one wheel had fallen into a rut no one cut and no one could escape. She clutched the letters, knuckles white, then loosened her grip piece by piece until the paper could breathe again. Halfway home, the wind rose. Dust came at them sideways. Eli leaned into it, hat brim low, hands steady. She closed her eyes and pictured a table someone had promised, a loaf someone had described, a laugh someone had written of but maybe never made. When she opened her eyes, the house stood where it had been, holding shape against weather, against notice, against the new word, lien, that felt like a snake coiled under the porch. She cooked that evening. Not much to work with, but she made the little turn into enough. Eli ate and didn't praise it. He ate as men do when something in the food tells them the house might not argue with them tonight. When they finished, he set his plate in the basin and returned to the yard. She found the hammer and straightened the picture above the mantel without thinking why that mattered. Later, while light died slow, he brought in a small box wrapped in canvas. He set it on the table and unrolled it. Inside lay letters not hers, receipts, a loan paper, a map of the North Pasture with numbers on the lines. Adam's hand here was quick, not the measured script of the promises. This was the hand of work. She looked from those papers to her own stack. Her letters were careful, even when hope had bled through them. He had written 2 different lives and sent her the one with bread in it. Eli did not look at her. He traced the map with his finger, then stopped at a point in the far corner where the fence cut against a dry wash. He tapped it once, a man counting a place he might lose first if men in neat vests got their way. The third morning brought rain that forgot how to commit. It spit and went. She spread sheets on the line anyway. The sky tested her, then let them dry. Small win. The house smelled cleaner when she brought them in, and for an hour the rooms looked like they belonged to breathing. They gathered eggs. One broke in her palm. She laughed, a quiet, surprised sound, and then stopped as if laughter were an offense in a house with a fresh cross. Eli glanced up at the sound, an instinct from a time when a woman's small joy didn't feel like a trespass, then went back to mending the harness. He fixed the porch step that caught her skirt each time she came through. He didn't tell her. She noticed when the wood didn't snatch at her hem. She set a loaf to rise and tapped dough with 2 fingers, as if testing what kind of day they were going to have. The loaf rounded, lifted, answered. She smiled at the bowl, not at him. He saw the smile anyway and put down the plane slower than before, as if noise could bruise something starting to breathe. By dusk, the notice sat between them like a third plate no one wanted to claim. She pushed it closer. He didn't push back. He read it again, and this time his breath tripped on one line. 30 days from posting. Someone had pinned the paper that morning. The clock that wasn't ticking on their wall had started somewhere else. When the lantern was lit, he brought out the cedar scrap he'd carved on the hill. 2 lines crossed, simple, exact. He set it on the mantel without explanation. She looked at it, then at him. He held her gaze for the length of a heartbeat, long enough to say he was building a shelf for a name, if a name chose to stay. Night deepened. Wind tested shutters, then left them alone. She sat with the letters in her lap and unthreaded the blue strip. The knot resisted, then gave. She spread the pages, put them in order, pressed her palm to the last one, and felt the ridge where his hand had pressed the same paper months ago. Heat rose behind her eyes and sat there, heavy but contained. She had learned somewhere far behind her to cry like a fox. No sound, only breath, only eyes. Tonight she didn't cry. She stacked the pages and tied them again. Eli stepped to the door, then paused. He took the notice from his pocket and set it beside the letters. 2 kinds of paper, two kinds of truth. He nodded once to both and blew the lamp out. On the fourth day, a rider came with the hour's heat on his shoulders and a grin he'd earned nowhere honest. He hammered a second notice to the gate. This one's smaller, meaner. Auction, it said, in letters big enough to hurt. He didn't look at the house. He looked at her standing on the porch, then at Eli, and tipped his hat with a kind of respect men give only when they're sure they can take it back. Eli stood quiet until the dust of the rider's horse settled in the weeds. Then he pulled the paper down, folded it without tearing, and slid it into his coat beside the first. She watched his hands. They didn't shake. They never shook. But his jaw set harder, the way a man locks his teeth when lifting something too heavy to carry alone. She went to the kitchen, took the loaf from its pan, cut the first slice. She wrapped it in cloth and set it on the porch rail where he would find it after dark. A small offering, a way of saying she saw the weight and would shoulder what little she could. He found it when the yard turned blue. He didn't eat it then. He broke it in half and left one piece on the rail. When she came out to shake the cloth at the step, the half nearest her was still warm. She took it without looking at him. Their hands didn't meet. Their intentions did. Before sleep, he climbed the hill. The cross watched him with the same blunt mercy as always. He stood beside it, eyes on the dark line of the far fence. He didn't speak to his brother. He spoke to the problem like a craftsman speaks to wood, naming grain, testing flecks, promising not to force what would split if rushed. Down below, a light moved in the kitchen, then stilled. The house held two people awake for each other without a word. At first light on the fifth morning, she found a hat by the door. Not new, not pretty, but sound. Inside the band, a short strip of blue thread had been stitched in a quick, awkward line. She set the hat on her head and went to the yard. Eli glanced once and returned to the harness. The corner of his mouth did something that wasn't a smile and wasn't nothing. They worked. Noon cut their shadows short. In the heat's flat glare, a figure appeared on the road from town, riding with the confidence of paper. Carter and Fox's man by the look of him. Vest too tight, boots too clean, mouth ready to talk in numbers. He dismounted, tied his reins, and looked past them to the acres as if measuring where profit would look best under new owners. He took off his hat. He did not bow. He laid a document on the porch rail and tapped it with 2 fingers. 30 days, he said, as if time belonged to him. Eli's hand came down flat on the paper, covering the seal. He didn't lift it. He didn't tear it. He let the man see how steady a denial could be without becoming a fight. She watched from the step, letters pressed to her side under her apron, a weight like a heartbeat. Adam's words, Eli's house, a field that might be auctioned to men who would never learn its stubbornness. Wind lifted dust and set it down again. The hawk that circled the south pasture tilted, then vanished into light. Between them a choice formed. Not loud, not sudden. A slow joining, like boards finally meeting square beneath a roof that had leaked too long. She drew breath, and with it a resolve that wasn't grand. It was practical. She would stay. She would work. She would be the line that didn't break when Wynn asked it to. She stepped off the porch and stood beside Eli, close enough that her shoulder almost touched his coat. Close enough that the man in the vest had to take a step back to see both their faces at once. The paper on the rail fluttered once in the wind. Eli's hand held it still. The man swallowed, recalculated, and smiled a thinner smile. Numbers can be patient. Some men are more so. He tipped his hat, promised to return, and left. When the road swallowed him, the yard breathed again. She let her arm brush Eli's sleeve for the length of a heartbeat. He didn't move. He accepted the contact the way parched ground accepts a first cautious rain. The day went on. So did they. The man with the vest left dust behind and the 30-day clock beating in the boards. After he rode out, the yard settled back into work. Work was the only language that did not lie. Eli hitched the bay and checked the harness twice, then a third time. She ground coffee fine with the heel of her hand and boiled it down until it tasted like resolve. When he came in, she poured without asking. He set his hat on the peg where a second peg waited empty and drank standing, as if chairs were for men who owned their days. They drew a line through the morning by choosing tasks they could count. He went to the north pasture to look at calves heavy enough to sell. She mended the split feed sack with small, tight stitches that would not draw the eye of men who price weakness. By noon, she had scrubbed the stove doors until the iron remembered it had once shone. By dusk, he had lifted the fallen length of fence and retied 2 posts with wire that cut his palms. He did not flinch. He washed the blood off in the horse trough, shook his hands dry, and went back for more wire. On the table, the 2 kinds of paper still lay: letters bound with blue thread, notices that smelled of ink and other men's plans. She moved neither. She set the bread beside them, then the salt, and ate with her shoulders squared as if court and harvest were the same kind of hunger. That night she took a lantern and went to the small chest in the back room where Adam's things had been folded and forgotten. She opened it because forgetting had ended. Claiming or losing would begin. Shirts lay clean but worn, a book with a torn spine. At the bottom, a small tin box with a hinge that resisted and then gave. Inside, a stub of pencil and a page torn from a ledger. Not letters. A list. Numbers stood in a neat row, crossed with dates: beans, nails, molasses, a rope, a doctor's visit. At the end, a shaky line in a different hand. Paid by Eli. She touched the place where the pencil had pressed too hard and scored the paper. Debt and mercy wore the same face in this house. She set the box back where she'd found it and closed the lid with the reverence one gives a body. In the kitchen, she trimmed the lamp and found 2 mugs set side by side. She did not move them. She let them stand as a stake in ground that had not belonged to anyone for too long. Wind hunted the eaves. The house held. On the 6th morning, they drove cattle. Dawn came thin, light sifting like ash through the lower sky. Eli swung the gate and whistled low. The small herd shifted, noses to wind, wary of the world because the world had trained them. She walked the far side with a switch of willow, her skirt tied up under her belt to keep free of hooves. The calves moved, balked, moved again. Dust painted their ankles. The bay tugged at the bit. Eli's hand on the rein did not leave. It spoke steadiness to any creature willing to hear. By mid-morning they had a rhythm. She learned where to stand so cows believed in forward. He learned when to lift a hand so she could breathe. Once, a brindle calf broke for the wash. She ran without asking to, slipped, caught herself on a rock, and turned the animal with a sweep that could have been called grace if anyone in sight owned the word. When she came back, hair loose at her neck, Eli handed her the canteen first. He looked away while she drank. The canteen shook once in her hand and then steadied. They brought the calves to a neighbor's pen on the county road, safe behind rails with nails driven deep. The neighbor had a scar along his jaw where a plow iron had once forgotten its place. He nodded, counted, and made a mark in chalk no rain could erase that day. 3 days, he said, meaning the traveling buyer who came when he chose. Eli nodded once. Words spent too freely left men broke. They walked home the long way, tired, boots full of dust. At the fork she stopped. The church stood there, low and plain, its bell quiet this far from Sunday. Beside it, a shed held wood for winters, and this week, boxes of cast-off clothes the women had been sorting. She looked at the steps, then at Eli. He didn't ask. She climbed them alone. Inside, cool darkness and bees in the rafters. The preacher's wife stacked hymnals with the precision of someone who had once counted medicine. She looked up, saw the blue thread in the newcomer's hair, the set to her mouth, and understood something important without names. She did not ask for a story. She fetched a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. It held nothing a man would notice. Needles, thread, a pair of scissors that cut clean. For the mending that matters, she said, and placed it in the other woman's hands. That was all. On the road back, a rider paced them from the ridge for a mile, then peeled away when he found no fear to feed on. Eli watched him go and did not waste breath naming him. She said nothing and tightened her hand on the bundle that promised a future made neat stitch by stitch. The days that followed took shape around a plan that did not advertise itself. Work early, hide the herd's weight until the buyer came. Check the pump, check the roof, check that the notice's date had not changed in the night like a trap that learns. She walked to town once more, alone this time, and traded a small silver brooch for flour. It had belonged to a mother she did not speak of. She made the exchange without ceremony, without telling Eli. That evening the bread rose higher. He tasted it and set his cup down soft. When thunder started speaking from the south, Eli climbed to the windmill head and greased the gear that always thought of quitting first. She braced the ladder with both hands and did not look up. Rain would bring grass. Grass would bring weight to the calves. Weight would bring a price, a simple ladder of hopes. It could break at any rung. In the dark before dawn on the 9th day, somebody cut the wire at the lower pasture. The bay's ears told the story before the first cow bawled. Eli was out the door with boots half pulled, rifle in hand not for shooting, but for reminding the world where lines were. She came with the lantern, flame shaded, its glow turned thin by fog. The cut was clean. The strand lay curled like a dead snake. Tracks ran in 2 directions, boots and hooves. Men had tried to turn the herd, then given up when a steer with more sense than a hired hand took offense. Eli fixed the wire without cursing. He bent new loops and twisted them down hard with hands that knew pain would heal later. She held the lantern and watched the corners. The night gave nothing back but their breath. When the wire pulled tight, he nodded. She doused the flame, and they walked the line, while sky found its color again. At midday, the buyer came, thin, neat, smelling of bay rum and arithmetic. He eyed the calves, prodded one, wrote numbers in a book, and named a price meant to insult. Eli did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned and opened the gate to let the calves back out. Dust rose. The buyer recalculated. He offered a number a man could live with for a month, not a year. Eli weighed air and said nothing. The buyer swallowed pride and added a little more. The chalk on the neighbor's post rubbed out. The money sat in a pouch that sagged like a small, grateful belly. It was not enough. It was a start. She counted it alone in the kitchen, spreading coins on a clean towel. Her mouth moved without sound. She made 3 stacks, bread and salt first, nails and oil, a sum kept back, wrapped in the towel and tucked where the floorboard lifted under the stove. She put the rest in Eli's hand. He didn't ask where the 4th stack had gone. He didn't want to learn the language of hiding from someone who already knew it by heart. The sheriff came that evening with his badge polished bright enough to warn people to mind their reflections. He took off his hat at the door and put it back on again, as if he had learned ritual and never the reasons behind it. He talked to Eli in the yard while she stood by the window and watched the angle of their shoulders. The sheriff's was comfortable. Eli's was carved from a tree that had survived lean years by knowing how to bend exactly once and no more. A paper passed between them, not the notice. Another, a summons to appear and answer numbers written in someone else's ink. The sheriff did not look at her, but when he tied the knot on the rolled paper, he pulled it too tight. Fear makes men clumsy. He left with his hat still shining. Eli folded the paper to fit the pocket where the notices slept. That night she found the cedar mark on the mantel and set her fingers along the cross of lines. The wood was smooth from his knife and from being touched by hands that needed a true thing to hold. She took the small tin box from Adam's chest and set it beside the cedar. 1 for debt, 1 for promise. She lifted the lamp and fed the wick. Eli came in with dust up to his knees and a new weariness in the corners of his eyes. She set a plate in front of him, then a second plate across, then added a 3rd fork and took it away. When he finished, he stood a long time with his hand on the back of the chair, as if testing whether it would bear more weight. He took the pouch and went out to the porch. She followed after a time and sat 2 steps down, distance clear, presence sure. He split the money into 3 small rolls and tied each with string. He handed her one without looking. She did not refuse. He set another beneath the top porch plank where mice could not find it. The 3rd he tucked into his boot. A man who expects trouble learns to walk with proof of his plans touching his bones. In the morning, the judge's clerk posted a new schedule with a new cruelty. The auction would be moved forward a week for efficiency. The clerk left the paper and his ink smell on the door and hurried away. She stood before it and felt the date shove her backward, though her boots did not move. She did not cry. She went to the shed, took the harness oil, and began to work it into the cracked leather as if saving a strap could save a house. Eli watched her from the threshold and did not interrupt. Men who work with wood know there is a moment you cannot force. He let her hands find it. In the afternoon, she walked the road to town alone. The sky threatened rain and then laughed at its own threats. She stepped into the mercantile and laid the brooches pin on the counter. The keep lifted an eyebrow and nodded. She asked for paper and a decent pencil. He counted out sheets with the suspicion of a man who had seen words ruin as often as they healed. She paid with 2 coins in her silence. On the way out, she stopped at the board where the auction notice had been nailed. She smoothed its curling edge with her palm and felt it scratch. At home, she set the paper on the table and smoothed it flat. She took the letters from the blue thread and lined them up end to end. She read the last one again. The words were simple. The last paragraph faltered. The line broke mid-thought. If I don't, and then nothing. Ink dried in a thin, starving line. She set her hand over the gap and breathed until her ribs stopped counting hertz. Then she wrote, not a plea, not a romance, a record, dates, work done, calves sold, wire cut and repaired, a sheriff's visit, a clerk's cruelty, names of witnesses who would not mind repeating what they had seen because truth likes daylight. She wrote like a woman making a list for a winter she meant to survive. When she finished, she folded the page and stitched the top with blue thread so it would not be lost. She set it on the mantel beside the cedar. The house now held something that was not only memory or threat. It held their account of themselves. Eli came in at twilight, hat in his hands. He saw the paper and did not touch it. He nodded once to the cedar. He nodded once to her. He took the lamp and climbed the hill, stood by the cross until the last light burned to the color of old brass. When he came down, his face held a new line that might have been weariness or might have been a decision measured and set. On the 12th day, Carter and Fox sent men to measure the north fence with a chain. Eli walked with them and never looked at the chain. He watched their hands. When one man planted a stake a foot inside the true line, Eli lifted it out and put it back where it belonged. He did not explain. He did not argue. He did not smile. The man laughed and then did not. The next morning, the preacher came with his hat in his hands and his wife behind him with a basket under a towel. They stepped into the kitchen and set bread on the table, and beneath it, a small envelope with a single bill and 3 coins. Pride refused, but need took it. Eli left the envelope where it lay until they had gone. Then he put the coins in the boot and the bill under the plank and the bread between them both. She cut it with a clean knife and handed him the heel. By then, talk had spread. Talk always finds a low place to run. Some of it helped, some of it wounded with smiles. Men in the saloon said Eli had brought a wife in by mistake. Women at the pump said grief had found a soft spot and tried to live there. Neither was true enough to keep. On the 15th day before sunrise, hoofbeats gathered at the end of the lane like thunder, deciding where to fall. Eli stood from the table without finishing his coffee. She wiped her hands and went to the door. The riders formed a dark line against the pale sky. In front, not the vest man, not the sheriff. A different weight. A carriage with curtains tied back and a face set inside like a coin in a frame. Mr. Carter himself, or a cousin close enough to sign for him, wearing a smile that called itself civility while it counted windows. The carriage halted. The door opened. The man stepped down without looking where he put his feet. He studied the house with quick eyes, turned them to the hill, and found the cross. His mouth shifted almost imperceptibly, not in pity, in calculation. He removed a glove and held out a paper. It gleamed with seals. Efficiency, he said, as if the word tasted like citrus. He did not look at her. He looked at Eli, and then at the land again, measuring wind with a banker's hand. Eli did not take the paper. He stood with his arms at his sides and his boots braced, the space between them filled with heat. She stepped down one stair until her shoulder almost met Eli's arm. The man's gaze flicked to the blue thread in her hair and back to Eli's face. He smiled again, smaller. His kind were trained to see fractions. He set the paper on the rail himself. The wind pressed it flat. The seal caught sun like an eye. 3 days, he said, voice mild as if giving a gift. 3 days would not carry a calf to another pound. 3 days would not teach a judge to taste his own conscience. 3 days would not turn a notice into mercy. But 3 days would be enough for a thing that had been gathering in the house like a storm with patience. A stand made not with rifles but with records. Not with shouts, but with men and women who would walk into heat to say what they had seen with their own eyes and were willing to sign. A ledger of truth against a ledger of debt. That night she spread fresh sheets on the table and wrote again. Names, times, the sheriff's knot too tight, the chain set a foot wrong, The buyer's first price and last, the preacher's bread, the clerk's schedule, the midwife's memory of letters delivered late, tied in blue, months after the hand that wrote them went still. Eli brought in the tin box and emptied it. Receipts, the loan paper, the map. He placed each beside her list as if laying tools on a bench before building something that must not fail. He took the cedar from the mantel and set it at the top. The cross of lines looked like a mark made to gather the others beneath it. He nodded as if agreeing with a voice he heard, and she did not. Rain finally came just before dawn. Not a tease this time. It hit the roof like a crowd. The house drank. The earth answered with a smell that had no price in any ledger ever kept. When the rain passed, a clear light fell over everything. The grave on the hill shed beads of water and looked less raw. The fence wire sang a thin line when the wind touched it. The notice on the rail sagged and tried to curl, but the seal's weight pinned it. They went to town. They didn't hurry. They walked the road with a steady pace that men read as danger if they know anything about men. The preacher met them at the square. The storekeep came out from behind his counter without pretending to be called. The blacksmith wiped his hands and left a horseshoe cooling on the anvil, because sometimes iron can wait. Even the clerk stood in the doorway and did not sit down when he wanted to. They carried no rifles. They carried paper. Into the judge's office, the same lemon oil and a new draft. The judge looked smaller in the morning light, as if the robe had shrunk or a boy had grown stolen inches overnight and now needed to give them back. He accepted their stack. He peeled pages apart with fingers that tried to be careful. He found the midwife's hand. He found the storekeep's note about dates that didn't line up. He found the chain man's stake measurement in a margin with a number quietly scratched out. He looked up once at her, and then at Eli, and then at the door, measuring which way the town was leaning. Men like him could count more than coins. They could count eyes. He opened his mouth to speak and closed it again, because noise outside overturned any words he thought to use. Hooves, many. Dust sliding in around the sill. Voices. The door swung, and the room filled with a man-sized weather. Hollow laughter, mistakes dressed as law, and the particular cold of money arriving to make a point. The man from the carriage stood in the doorway and smiled with practice. Behind him, 2 deputies. Behind them, nobody carrying friendship. The judge lifted a hand and found it did not carry. The man in the doorway stepped forward and tapped the seal with a gloved finger. Efficiency, he said one more time, as if the repetition made it true. The room held its breath. Eli's hand went to the cedar and settled there, palm on the crossed lines as if touching the shape could keep it steady and win. She did not reach for him. She set her palm on the list she had stitched with blue and held it flat so it could not be blown from the table. The storm and the silence met, and everything that had been moving, quietly and with purpose, in the house on the hill turned its face toward the fight that had finally come to meet it. The judge's chamber was too small for what the morning carried. Rain smell still clung to the town, but the air inside felt dry, brittle, ready to snap. Carter stood with the seal under his glove, deputies flanking him like bookends meant to crush anything placed between. Eli stood with his hand on the cedar cross. She stood with hers pressed flat on the stitched list. The judge cleared his throat, words caught in it. "This is irregular." Carter smiled, a banker's smile, practiced and pale. "Irregular is when men don't keep their debts. Irregular is when a widow pretends a promise still holds weight." His eyes flicked at her like a pin. "Irregular is when a house stays standing past the hour it's been marked for auction." The room waited for Eli. He said nothing. Silence thickened until even the deputies shifted. She lifted the page, unfolded it slow, and read names aloud. The midwife, the storekeep, the preacher, witnesses. She read the sheriff's knot too tight, the stake driven wrong, the buyer's lie of price. Each fact landed like stone on wood. Eli laid Adam's tin box beside her sheet. Receipts. The loan paper, dates crossed with Eli's hand where debt had been paid before. A map showing land measured honest, not stolen. He set them down one by one, steady as fence posts, until the table held more truth than the seal could weigh. Carter's smile cracked. He leaned forward, low voice. "You think paper saves you? Paper burns." Eli finally spoke. "So does rope when it's tied wrong." The deputies stirred, hands near holsters. The judge lifted his gavel, wood striking wood, louder than thunder in the small room. Enough! His eyes darted, measuring which side the room leaned toward. For once, it wasn't money that outnumbered. It was eyes. Town eyes. Men and women pressed in the doorway, watching. The judge swallowed. This case is deferred. No auction, no forfeiture, until claims are settled by inquiry. He tapped the gavel again, softer. 30 days. Carter's jaw tightened. He pulled on his gloves slow, like a man promising he'd return with teeth sharper than law. He stepped back, deputies with him, dust trailing their boots. The door slammed. Silence fell. Then the room exhaled. She folded the list, tied it again with blue thread, set it in the tin box, and closed the lid. Eli lifted the cedar cross, set it on top, and nodded once to the judge, once to the town, then walked out without waiting for thanks. She followed, the baby letters still heavy in her apron pocket, though she hadn't carried them in. Outside, the light was harsh, stripped clean by rain. The street looked different. Same dust, same boards, but something shifted. The house on the hill wasn't just a house anymore. It was a stand. On the ride back, they didn't speak. Words would have broken what silence was holding steady. At the gate, she stepped down first, lifted the bundle of supplies from the wagon, and carried them inside as if the house had always been hers to tend. Eli untied the reins, brushed the bay, checked the latch twice, and stood long by the porch rail where the notice had once been nailed. The wood still bore its scar. That evening, she baked. He mended the hinge that had grown since spring. When the bread was ready, she set the loaf on the table between them. He cut 2 thick slices, gave her the first, kept the second, and left the heel untouched. She watched him leave it, understood, and set it aside for tomorrow. Later, she found him by the grave. He stood with hat in hand, cedar cross at his feet. He wasn't carving this time. He was just standing. She placed the lantern near him, the light reaching only so far, and stepped back, leaving him his silence. When he came down, his face was hard but clearer, like a man who'd finally accepted he was carrying something worth keeping. That night, the storm returned. Not rain, men, 3 horses, hooves in the yard, voices low, a hand on the barn latch. Eli was already at the door, rifle steady. She held the lamp high, eyes sharp. When the latch lifted, Eli fired once, above their heads. The crack split the night. Horses bolted. The men cursed, retreated, dust vanishing quick as smoke. The baby letters pressed in her apron like another heartbeat. She clutched them tight, then let them go, leaving them on the table beside Adam's box. Her hand shifted to the cedar cross instead. Eli lowered the rifle but didn't set it down. He stood by the door until dawn broke pale across the yard. She stood beside him, shoulder near his, their silence bound not by grief anymore, but by decision. Morning came thin and hard, a blade of light through the east window. The night's riders had vanished into their own shadows, but the yard held their shape. The trampled corner by the barn, the scuff on the porch rail where a gloved hand had weighed the wood and called it his. Eli checked the latch once more and let his palm rest there a breath longer than habit. She watched from the doorway, hair tied with the blue thread, the stitched list tucked back in Adam's tin box beneath the cedar cross. The day did not ask for speeches, it asked for work. They set to it. He took the north trough apart and sanded the rot until cedar remembered strength. She boiled water, scrubbed smoke from the rafters, aired the quilts that had learned the smell of worry. By noon, the rooms breathed easier. At dusk, the fence wire sang when the wind brushed it, clean and tight. 2 days of this, 2 days of men riding by slower than necessary, 2 days of townsfolk stopping at the gate to ask if anything was needed, and leaving small things when told no. Flour, a coil of wire, a jar of grease, not charity, weight shared. On the 3rd evening, a fire started under the eaves of the far shed. Not a lightning strike, a match. The flames took the dry wood quick and hungry. Eli ran with the pump line before she finished shouting his name. He planted his boots and aimed the stream where heat spoke loudest. She formed a chain, bucket from trough to hand, hand to hand, hand to fire. The neighbor boy appeared without being called, then 2 women with skirts tucked and eyes fierce. Sparks flew, smoke coughed. The shed's roof sagged, then held. The fire fell back into black edges and hiss, beaten by water and stubbornness. When the last hiss died, the boy gagged and laughed, both at once. The women pressed damp cloth to their mouths and stared at the shed, like a thing you'd dare to try again. Eli set the pump handle down and rolled his shoulders as if putting a weight back in its place. She stood near, breath rough, cheeks streaked, hair unmade by heat. He looked at her hands, red, raw, uncomplaining. He took one, turned it palm up, and poured clean water over it slow. No words. He dried it in his own sleeve, not the rag, and let it go. They slept sitting that night, backs against the same post, the cedar cross on the table between them and the tin box beneath it. Toward dawn, a coyote tested the fence and thought better of it. Wind carried the smell of ash and wet pine. The house kept standing. In the gray before light, hoofbeats gathered at the lane again. Not sneaking this time, not ashamed. A line of riders, then the carriage. Carter stepped down as if the ground had been arranged for him in advance. The deputies took their places. There was a rhythm to this entrance. Men who believe in inevitability perform it like prayer. He lifted a new paper, pressure marks still white where the seal had been crushed. Efficiency, he said, tasting it, as always, like citrus. Behind him, the judge's clerk sat stiff on a borrowed horse. The judge himself did not come. Men who like to call themselves impartial prefer distance. Eli didn't reach for the paper. He reached for the pump handle and set it upright again from where the night's fight had bent it. The act turned away grand gestures without needing a single word. She stood on the porch step, one foot on wood, one on packed earth, the stitched list under her apron. A small wind lifted the blue thread at her neck and laid it back down where it belonged. Carter tried patience. He spoke of dates, of liens, of the dignity of process. He spoke to the rail, the gate, the fence, anywhere but the people who had kept the house from burning. When patience found no purchase, he turned to threat. But men who threaten after they've already tested fire look foolish even to hired eyes. She stepped forward, the list in her hand. She did not unfold it. She did not raise her voice. There was a fire, she said. Men watched it burn. Men helped put it out. She let the silence after those words do the work that oaths sometimes cannot. The deputies looked at the scorched eaves and the black streak up the shed wall. One of them shifted, shame finding its way up from boot to jaw. Carter's smile did not crack. It learned. "We are within the law," he said. Eli set the cedar cross on the porch rail with care, as if measuring where a name might go. He placed Adam's tin box beside it, lid open, receipts breathing air. "So are we," he said, "and we intend to stay here long enough to prove it." Carter weighed the scene like a scale that knows itself biased. Men at the road paused their wagons to see which way the town would lean. The clerk's pencil hovered, then set itself down on the saddle horn. The blue in the thread at her hair held the eye like a small, unignorable sky. Carter folded the paper back to his chest, slid it into his coat, and tipped 2 fingers off his hat. 3 days, he repeated, softening the edge for the deputy's sake. Then we're done repeating ourselves. 3 days, Eli said, not as surrender, as promise. They left dust and the smell of cologne behind. 3 days became a litany. Fix, list, walk the fence, breathe. On the first, she baked until the house remembered warmth as something other than survival. On the second, he traded a small calf the buyer had missed and came back with nails and a length of chain that would not lie. On the third, they climbed the hill at dusk and stood by Adam's grave until the sky learned brass again. She held the letters there. The first one, the last one, the break in the line where his ink had failed him. If I don't, she drew the blue thread across the bundle, tied it twice, and laid it on the mound. She did not weep. She knelt, then stood. Her hand found Eli's coat to steady the rise and let go. He did not step closer. He did not step away. Morning of the hearing came clear and cold. They went to town without hurry, carrying the tin box and the cedar cross wrapped in cloth. The square was full, not with spectacle this time, with a kind of practical attention. The preacher stood by the door, hat off. The storekeep wore his apron like armor. The blacksmith leaned on his hammer with the gentleness of a man who knows what a blow can do. Inside, the judge looked older. Perhaps the robe had learned weight. He read the clerk's report first, eyes skimming, mouth set. He read their list next, each name, each hour, each small theft and correction. He touched the burned edges of the shed with his fingertips as if heat lingered in ink. He set the tin box on his desk and the cedar on top, where the crossed lines made a still point out of the scattered day. Carter spoke, of course. He said what such men say: contracts, rights, precedent. He said it well. He said it long. He didn't say fire. No man who wears law like a coat mentions matches unless forced. Eli didn't interrupt. When the judge's eyes turned to him, he lifted one receipt and placed it on the desk. Paid. He lifted the map and set a calloused finger on the true fence line. He said one sentence only: "This land has been held honest." She put the list beside Adam's letter with the broken line and left it there, as if the gap belonged to the record too. Then she did a small, strange thing. She took the blue thread from her hair, cut it with the preacher's wife's scissors, and tied it around the cedar, not firm and plain. The judge stared at the knot a long time. Then he looked at the door and what pressed beyond it, then at Carter's seal, then at the burned smell that seemed to have traveled in with the box. "This court," he said, each word measured, "recognizes the stay as permanent. Claims by Carter and Fox are denied for cause. Errors in notice and—" He hesitated, picking a word that would save him later. "Misconduct connected to enforcement." He lifted the gavel. "The Sutter place remains Sutterland." The gavel fell. The room did not cheer. It breathed. Carter's expression did not change. Only his eyes moved, past the judge, past Eli, to her, to the blue thread on the cedar. He tipped his hat a fraction, a man who knows which fights to postpone. He would find other acres. He would say other words. He turned and left with the quiet efficiency he worshipped. People said small things afterward: a hand on an arm, a nod, offers of seed, a joke that remembered gentleness. The clerk took off his hat when he passed Eli and looked at his boots. The sheriff looked nowhere at all. They walked home slow. Home felt like a word that had stopped pretending. The light along the fence had a different color. The windmill turned like a thing that meant to keep turning. At the gate, he paused and touched the post where notices had been nailed. His fingers found the old holes. He didn't sand them out. Scars remind wood it's been tested and didn't split. In the yard, she set the cedar cross where he had once measured a place for a name. Above the door, beneath the beam worn smooth by seasons, she held a nail steady. He lifted the hammer and drove it home with the economy of a man who refuses to miss. The cedar hung straight. She stepped back. He did too. For a long breath, they looked without speaking. Then she went inside, found the little box with Adam's pencil stub, and brought it out. She stood on the threshold, pencil in hand, and waited. Eli watched her, jaw tight, not with refusal, with something like awe. She reached up and pressed the pencil to the cedar and wrote a single word in a hand that was not steady and did not need to be: Eli. She wrote another beneath it, smaller, the letters leaning toward the first as if to learn how to stand. Hannah. No vows, no blessing. 2 names on one piece of wood, placed where the weather could touch them every day and teach them to last. Evening came soft for once. She baked a fresh loaf. He cut the heel and set it on the rail and left it. She took it later without their hands meeting. After supper, he carried a chair to the porch. She brought the other. They sat with space enough for summer between them and watched the hill darken. Coyotes sang and were answered. The house made the small sounds of a thing that intends to be here tomorrow. When the lamp needed trimming, he rose first. When the baby wine lifted the hem of her skirt, she put her palm flat on the porch to still herself and felt the grain run under her hand. It felt like a map you learn by walking it every day. It felt like staying. She fetched the letters from the grave at last light, took them not to keep promises that couldn't be kept, but to make new ones with the paper that remained. She laid the bundle on the table, untied the thread, and took a single page. On the back, in the space where nothing had been written, she wrote a loaf's recipe with careful measures and a note about heat that you only learn by burning and trying again. She set that page in the tin box. The rest she tied and left where the cedar could watch them without judging. Eli stood in the doorway and didn't break the quiet. He stepped out, checked the latch, and came back in. He set his hat on the second peg and did not look at it, as if it had always been occupied. Then he took the small cedar shaving from his pocket, the one he had whittled on the hill months ago when he believed names were a danger, and set it beside the pencil on the sill. They slept that night under a roof they had kept. The cross of cedar over the door took the moon without complaint. The names held. Morning would bring fences and feed, repairs and seasons, and men who think papers can measure a home. Morning would bring them too, two people who knew what to do with dawn.